Good evening, and welcome to the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York, and to the 9th season of the Artisan Lectures. I'm Karin Taylor, Program Director of the General Society. This program is supported in partnership with the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council. I'd also like to thank Thomas Donahue, who has created a special window display for tonight's talk. The General Society was founded in 1785 by the skilled craftsmen of New York City, artisans who represented 22 different trades. These included carpenter, blacksmiths, saddlers, tailors, and silversmiths. Today, our 234-year-old organization continues to serve the people of the City of New York through our educational and cultural programs. These include our Lock Museum, and you are very welcome to visit the Lock Museum afterwards, the John M. Mossman Lock Collection, our library, of course, of which you're in this evening, our tuition-free Mechanics Institute, and finally, our lecture series, of which tonight's lecture is part of. Our lecture series is nearly 200 years old. Single-handedly, contemporary architects draw by hand is an inspiring collection of 220 hand drawings by more than 40 emerging architects and well-known practitioners from around the world. The book explores the reasons they draw by hand and gives testimony to the continued vitality of hand drawing in architecture. I also want to mention that this really wonderful book is for sale this evening, so please feel free. The purchase table is at the back of the room. Tonight, we're very pleased to welcome Nalina Moses. It was Nalina's vision to create this book. And three of the architects featured in the book, Bishakh Som, Katie Shima, and Pablo Castro, are all here tonight to discuss single-handedly. As I mentioned, the book was conceived by Nalina Moses, who is an architect and writer. Her writing in art, architecture, and design has appeared both in print and online. I'm now so pleased to introduce to you Nalina Moses.
Good evening. Thank you. Thank you all for coming out tonight. I'm thrilled to be here and to share my book with you. This is such a beautiful space. Firstly, I'd like to thank Karin and Victoria at the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of New York City. I love every word of that name. I'm especially pleased to be here because of the organization's commitment to craft and to trade, to education. I know that they teach here classes in construction-related industries. And I'm very happy to be standing here in front of a real, or inside of a real library with real books. I'd also like to thank Abby Sacco, who leads the Harvard Club Architecture and Design Special Interest Group, for her support. Tonight, I would like to tell you a little bit about the book. I'll do that. And three of the architects who shared their own work for the book are here tonight. I'll pass the mics on to them, so you'll get to see their work and hear from them. Afterwards, we'll talk a bit about what it means to be an architect and draw in the age of the computer, and why we keep drawing by hand, and what will happen in the future in our profession. Oops, technical difficulty. Am I?
had it in your hand, so I thought you had it on.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. I work as an architect full-time, and I draw. That's what architects do. We draw... We draw. We draw by hand. That's what we do. It's the primary way we work. It's what we do to study the world, structure our thoughts, compose designs, tell stories, and capture dreams. And more pragmatically, it's how we communicate with colleagues, seduce clients, and instruct builders. This is an illustration by Walter Pickler, a contemporary Austrian architect, and I love it because it's showing the physical work that goes into a drawing. The act of drawing by hand it's an external physical material act. It's a craft that involves tools and materials. It's an act of performance that involves the whole body. And it's also an interior, personal, immersive act that carries deep values, cultural and personal. And it's an act that can be potentially visionary, revolutionary, and life-affirming. And architects have drawn for centuries. For centuries, nothing changed. These are the tools that my great-grandfather used in the 1930s. Triangles, pencils, and people had been drawing this way for centuries up until the computer, up until about the 1990s. So these are the tools my great-grandfather used, and these are the tools that I used when I was an architecture student. Nothing had really changed. And then all of a sudden, everything changed. In the 1990s, the computer became used as drafting. In school, I drew primarily by hand. I graduated from school in 1994, and in the years before that, I drew almost exclusively by hand when I was in school. And I drew very freely. I was not a great architecture student. But I wasn't held back, as I am now, perhaps, by ideas of what I thought was beautiful or correct. So I experimented, and I drew in charcoal. I drew in lead, in very hard lead, on vellum. And I drew collages like this, using found materials and contact paper. So there's a sense of freedom and experiment. And then when I entered the workplace, this is what the workplace looked like. I drafted almost exclusively by computer. At my first jobs, I had a computer and a drafting board. But after 2 or 3 years, I just had a computer. And I drew that way for almost 2 decades, exclusively with a computer. And that image of architects drawing by hand, it's persistent. That hasn't changed. Although we draw, the bulk of what we do is draw with computers, the image of the architect drawing by hand is persistent. All of the great modern architects drew by hand. That's Cini Boeri on the top and Frank Lloyd Wright on the bottom at their desks. This is Zaha Hadid. Even architects that came after modernism drew by hand, architects that were my heroes, that are my heroes. It's part of their image that they continue to draw by hand. This is Norman Foster drawing by hand in different ways. These are all images from his Instagram feed, highly curated images. You can see how important it is for him to draw by hand, or to present the image of himself drawing by hand. And this is a picture of his office. And you'd be hard-pressed to find a drawing or a pencil there. All of the work's being performed on the computer. So it's a real tension. We think of our craft as a handicraft, and we think of our drawings as handcrafted, but most of the work goes on with a computer. After 2 decades of working in an office, my working methods started to shift. And in addition to producing working drawings and schematic drawings on the computer, I started to work in my notebook more seriously, to sketch more seriously, for myself mostly, in a very pragmatic way. And I continue to work this way. I take notes sketching. I use sketches to solve problems, and I find I can work more freely, I can solve problems more quickly, and I can communicate better with other people by drawing in this way. So that's the way I work. And I wondered, are other architects working this way too? Working officially on the computer and then working on the side by hand, and that's how the idea of the book began. And I began work on the book by putting an ad online, submitting or asking for submissions from architects online around the world, and I received over 400 submissions. And I found that there are many architects continuing to draw by hand. Sometimes it's private work, sometimes it's dreamy visionary work, sometimes it's in support of the work they do in an office. But many, many architects are continuing to draw by hand. It remains a vital skill and a vital practice. And I believe it will remain a vital skill and a vital practice. And to that end, I'm going to introduce you to 3 architects who continue to draw by hand, but draw at a much different level than I do. They are very committed and very serious and very, very talented. And first, Pablo Castro will speak.
Thank you. Thanks for being here. Nalina, can you instruct me? How is this? Oh, no, that's fine. Okay, I got it. This is the second time we do this. We did it at Rizzoli maybe a month ago. And it's, whenever you have to speak in public, it is the day after that you think about what you should have said, right? So this is kind of like the rare opportunity to try to improve on what we did last time. But maybe improvisation is better. I don't really know. There are maybe about 15 images that Nalina requested, and we've been in practice for quite a while. So these are, some of them are very old, some of them are recent, and there are of different kinds. It's probably not of any interest to go too much into the contents of the images, since the drawings, although they might be eloquent or appealing at some level, in our case, they're all instrumental towards the production of a built work of architecture. And since these images are shown by themselves, they might not be that interesting in that way. But this is a house we designed in the Hamptons maybe about 10 years ago for friends. The house shows a house divided with a gap in the middle that becomes a kind of intermediate space that is neither totally outside nor totally inside and spirit. And jokingly, we called it the villa of the excluded middle. And the clients rejected it because they said they didn't want anything excluded. They wanted everything included. So it was never built. I think that, I don't know, in a way, one of the things that I thought one day in the shower that I should have said last time was mention the famous saying by Man Ray, I thought it was, that, the saying seems kind of quaint now, but talking about his practice as a practice that does both, that was based both in drawing and photograph, he said, I draw what I cannot photograph, and I photograph what I do not wish to draw. It seems like it has been a long time, no? And I think that the very fact that Nalina has decided to put this book together and that the book is significant is because drawing by hand doesn't mean the same thing anymore that it used to mean, or it's definitely a dying art. These are some design sketches. The other one was a presentation drawing. These ones were sort of for internal office consumption of a tent on the courtyard of a restaurant in Beijing, in a neighborhood where all the embassies are in Beijing that is called Sanlitun, and in which there is a group of curtain wall glass buildings that the developers decided to call the village, the Sanlitun village. You know, it doesn't look anything like a village, of course. So we imagined some kind of canvas village architecture to be a sort of temporary space outside the restaurant that we were designing. This is the restaurant itself. These are presentation drawings. The restaurant never got built because, well, the story goes that we got into a conflict that we did not know about with the wife of the owner of the restaurant because we requested a down payment before we did anything, and that was not usual practice. You know, you're supposed to draw for a while and present proposals and then get paid. And because we did not do that, our restaurant didn't get built. But anyways, it's not a story that interesting a story. This is the same, another view. An architect friend of mine that already passed away who was always in his assertions of things very provocative and confrontational, said in the 90s when you know the tidal wave of drawing by computer had taken over everything, that what you really need to make architecture is a pencil and a piece of paper. And if you need something more than that, there's something wrong with your talent, I suppose. You know, that's somewhat nostalgic statement, I think. These are details for also for internal consumption and basically for construction, because this is a pavilion in the Shenzhen Biennale in 2011 that we built. The curator was Terry Riley, and we got invited to do it, and we did it with students from the Shenzhen Architecture School. So, you know, we had to detail everything, but it wasn't necessary to have working drawing documents, so we just did it this way. This is a drawing for a building that actually got built in Beijing. It is a kindergarten, a 50,000 square foot kindergarten for 260 children. And the drawing tries to catch the dirty atmosphere of the Beijing pollution, you know, as part of as the more significant aspect of the context in which the project would be. The interesting thing about the man-raised statement too is this kind of confrontation between photography and drawing, which was, you know, of course, one of the drivers for the earlier 20th century and late 19th century transformation to our idea of what art might be. Are interesting if you think that an artist has such a choice, because for the artist the object being worked on is the purpose of the effort, while for an architect it never is. In a way, it's always the means to an end. There are, of course, paper architects, which are architects that are good enough at drawing and frustrated enough with the capitalist system of building production that they decide to drop out of it altogether and imagine what could be if we lived in a different kind of society. But setting that aside, the thing that the difference between photograph. Of course, you can work with collages and other sort of artistically developed techniques, but the difference is, and what's interesting about Man Ray's statement, I think, is you draw what you cannot photograph, and the architect typically can never photograph what she's drawing, because the job of the architect is precisely to bring about something that doesn't exist yet. You know, you don't always have that opportunity. Sometimes you have to replicate or modify or adjust at the level of the conceptual backbone of a project, something that already exists. But at its purest, if you like, or at its highest, the practice of the architect gives that latitude, you know, to create something that doesn't exist. This is an imaginary project for an expansion to the city of Ascoli Piceno in Italy, in El Mache, to which we were invited to participate in the creation of a fictitious tourist book. So the city is very beautiful, you know, sort of with echoes of San Gimignano, with a lot of towers from both Middle Ages and the Renaissance, and it has been sort of defaced by a periphery that is what the Italians call abusiva, which means is illegally constructed and, you know, free of any thing other than immediate instrumental intent. So our project contemplated the creation of a new city that would, in the periphery of the old city, that would replace this sort of 20th century abusive neighborhood. This is one of the apartments, and these towers were all the same, and they were 100 meters tall. And the apartments were developed in 3 floors. And this is, you know, a view of the living room of one of the apartments looking back into the existing city. This was a project done totally for ourselves. And my friend, the artist, that we had a show in Ascoli Piceno, but it was never intended. There are other kinds of drawings, you know, the drawings in which you're not representing an idea. Obviously, you're trying to figure out what you're trying to do. These are drawings for a competition of the Swiss embassy in the city of Seoul in South Korea. And the program called for the ambassador's house and the chancery, you know, the place where you go to get your passport and so on. And we thought that it was interesting to, you know, this was maybe about, well, there's a date there. I can't read it, but maybe it was 2012 or 2013. In the age of globalization, and in which, you know, the power, the real power that makes things happen or not happen is in the hand of multinational corporations and not nations, we thought that there is that embassies are a little bit obsolete in a way. So we set out to look for a project that would sort of express that kind of the hypocrisy of foreign relations, you know, the kind of sham friendship between nations, you know, that nations seen from a point of view of conservative ideology are natural enemies. But, you know, foreign relations always present themselves as a form of friendship between nations. So the idea for this was to find a way in which the building could have a hypocritical friendly front, and in the back, something that gave it credibility. So the building projects itself towards the street, and we were looking for some kind of orderly grid that would express the kind of Swiss organized spirit. And the house of the ambassador in the back would give it legitimacy by being, you know, give it authenticity by virtue of the fact that a real Swiss person lived there. Anyways, it was, a game for us, but of course, we didn't win. And this is a presentation rendering, of that same idea. So while here we were sort of like shooting in the dark and looking for what to do by drawing, and actually getting, as you can see, very sidetracked with decorative dead ends and so on. Here, in the presentation drawing, once we already know what we think we need to do, things are much more precise, and but they are both sort of hand drawings. This is a cafeteria for a high school dormitory in the city of Bolzano in northern Italy, near Austria. And I don't have the building, but the building is a very simple, normal, polygonal building, and it has one wing that's sort of inflated. And our fantasy for the project that it was the kind of budding potential for love between students that made the public spaces of the building more intense and created this deformation that pushed the walls of the building to make it into what the Italians call a gonfione, or like a big inflated rubber ball. But all this, I think in a way, I was thinking that it would be, it's kind of hard to talk about the drawings. So when you do them, you kind of hope that they speak for themselves and persuade whoever needs to be persuaded, because all these things need to be funded to be built. But I was trying hard to think, and I thought one thing that would be interesting is to talk about that difference between the drawing that already is presenting something of which you're already convinced, to convince others, or the drawing that is a decision tool, decision tool of design. This is a chapel in a martyr's site for peregrines, or what's the name? Missionaries that came to South Korea and were slaughtered by soldiers. I don't know. And it's a very central location. It's in the city of Seoul, near the main train station. And it's considered to be sacred ground. 50% of people in Korea are Christians. But the funny thing is that the sacred ground, below the sacred ground, there are like 4 stories of parking garage. So the sacred ground is way below down there. So our idea was to sink part of the church into the garage. And that's why you have this kind of, perimeter wall that is solid, and the church is above. There are other things to it, but anyways. And this, so this drawing literally, this is also a Korean project for open art archive, sort of a new way of thinking, kind of like this space, in the sense that you're in an auditorium, you're in a space for social interaction. But the space is kind of hybrid because, we're looking at the stacks. Maybe this is where people read. I don't know. So this is a similar idea, the fact that it's an accessible archive for art, and people can peruse the storage spaces and look at artworks that are not typically set up for public access or not being exhibited. So, but here is again that. So, in a way, what I wanted to say about the fact that this book exists, in a way that what it suggests to me that there's an implication that that hand drawing needs to be defended, or that, drawing by hand at some level needs to be protected because it's better than drawing by computer, or that drawing by computer. It definitely is a kind of cultural loss if people, it will be a cultural loss when people finally stop drawing by hand. But, that sort of kind of falls into the old, somewhat nostalgic discussion about the value of technology, if technology is good or bad for people. And I think, at least in our case, our practice, I don't think our practice would have been able to exist if we had not started at a time in which computers were also available to run the office. We wouldn't have been able to afford it. We don't come from the typical sort of background that is that would allow you to start an office and spend, a certain sum of money that might be necessary until you get off the ground and you have clients, or we don't even have those connections. So, but the computer allow you, in a way, the flexibility of doing with 2 or 3 people what you would otherwise need 10 people to do if we work a lot. But the computer does do that. So the implication of computer drawing as a kind of negative reality that is destroying something beautiful. I'm not saying that this is what Nalina is doing. It's just I think that what someone could make out of this book. What does this book mean? Someone could misinterpret it that way or interpret it that way. So I think it's much more complicated. I think it's more about who has access to that technology, right? Or it's sort of similar to I don't know if it happens to you, but it happens to me every time I buy a book. I have to decide if it's going to be a digital book or if it's going to be the real book. And then I don't have any more room for real books. You know what I mean? They're like piled up all over the place and they're collecting dust. But who says that at some point, the hundreds of books that we might have collected in a laptop or an iPad are not accessible anymore. I mean, it doesn't fully depend on us. There might not be electricity anymore, and we will be able to charge the iPad, or I don't know, Apple might decide to take your books away or something. I mean, it's so. Anyways, so this is another use of drawing. This is a book. We write books sometimes. So this is one of the books we wrote that was called Lost City. And it was a sort of like a short meditation about the origins of architecture, as implied by L'Abbé de Logier in the 18th century, as being natural. So architecture is somehow being natural, like, people say that other things are natural, like the stock market or the organization of society into classes and things like that. So this is a kind of refutation of that idea. And these are sort of preparatory notes for the book. So there's a kind of shorthand at work here in which the text become eloquent by referring, in a very explicit way. My fantasy is to think that it'll take many more pages to do the same thing without drawing that you can do if you're sort of writing notes for a book and at the same time you're sort of drawing. So the purpose of our book was, or one aspect of this book was that is this sort of theorizing about the origins of architecture would be paired up with an actual project. So the drawing on the upper right, sort of towards the middle, and then in the bottom and the left here, is the project with which the book ends. And it's a project for the city of Venice. This was a book that was commissioned by the FRAC, which is the Museum of Architecture Drawing in the city of Orléans in France. They commissioned a number of architects to do books, and this was our book. But the purpose of the project was to think an imaginary solution for the urban problem of Venice that was not an urbanistic solution, but it was an architectural solution. And it was a solution based on an alternative mode of production. So the city is the building is like a small city in itself, and it has a kind of roof that floats over the water that is an industrial nave, in which people would have access to the latest technology, in which the government would invest just like they invest in roads or schools or hospitals or bridges, to give people of Venice an alternative to working for the tourism industry. I think that's my last slide, right? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Pablo, and thank you, Nalina, and thank you to the General Society for having all of us here. It's an honor to be here. I'm Katie. I'm an artist and an architect, and I think that when architecture is at its best, it makes us feel human. We crave natural light and fresh air. We want the spaces where we live and where we work to make us feel some connection to the outdoors while still protecting us from the wind and the rain and the extremes of hot and cold. And when architecture is at its best, it plays off these elements. It complements them. It allows us to feel that connection. But sometimes we architects are forced to go to extreme lengths to replace natural processes with artificial ones. So we replace sunlight with electric light. We can even tune it so that it mimics the color of the sun as it changes throughout the day. We replace natural ventilation, fresh air, with these complex mechanical systems that temper air to just the right temperature and deliver it at just the right velocity, so that you almost forget that there's this vast complex system behind every wall, behind every ceiling. And in my first job in architecture, I found myself spending a lot of time dealing with this one particular ceiling that was crammed with ductwork and pipes and conduit, and it began to crowd out the living space. So the infrastructure that was meant to support life was actually, in a sense, crowding it out. And I thought that there had to be a better way to go about this. And it doesn't just happen in architecture. It also happens, in a lot of aspects of our lives where, for example, the way we bring food to the table, we no longer rely on rain and sort of natural processes to farm. We use industrial processes to synthesize the chemicals that are necessary for sustaining life. And in doing so, we add another layer of complexity that may have consequences that we don't yet fully understand. We warm the planet. We create instability in ecosystems. We even create political instability by doing this. And of course, our technological solutions have vastly improved the quality of life. They've lifted billions out of poverty and saved millions of lives. And we should not, and we cannot go backwards. But we also have to go forwards with our eyes open. And my drawings and sculptures are vignettes reflecting the ways that we humans affect and are affected by our environment. They're a new kind of landscape for this new Anthropocene era that we find ourselves in, a new understanding of the sublime. The sublime is a feeling of awe mixed with terror. It's a feeling of being overwhelmed. And in our society, I feel overwhelmed a lot of the time. Looking back at some of the landscapes that inspired Turner and some of the Romantic painters, these are inspiring landscapes of, the sea and the mountains. I do feel that same sense of awe, but I also feel overwhelmed by how fragile those systems are, how subject to human imposition they are, and I know that despite my best efforts, I'm leaving an uncertain planet for my son, and sometimes that problem is so large and so overwhelming that the only way I can deal with the feeling is to draw it. My drawings and sculptures are made, well, my drawings are all made by hand. I choose to draw by hand, and I use traditional architectural drafting tools like I use a Mayline, I use graphite, I use refillable pens that my uncle left me from when he learned to draft in the 1950s. And I do it, kind of building on what you were saying, Pablo, and not because I think architecture needs to be defended, but because I think, with artificial intelligence, when the robots come to take my job, they can take the computer part of the drafting away from me happily, but they can't take the sketching. They can't take the kind of immediacy of drawing as an architectural tool. That part will still be for humans to do, at least for the time being. So I do continue to draw by hand. I also make sculptures that I use more contemporary digital fabrication tools like the CNC machine and the laser cutter to extend traditional woodworking and weaving techniques to help kind of push the level of detail in these sculptures to the limit of human perception. At some points, these both the drawings and sculptures seem like they may be precise enough to be computer generated, but up close, you can kind of see the imperfection of the human hand and the variation in the materials that I use. And for me, there's something compelling about this process of creating an object that strives for perfection, but that reveals the fallibility of its human origins. These landscapes are complex and intricate, blurring the boundary between the hand and the machine. The overall composition gives way to increasing levels of detail upon closer examination. Looking at these pieces, you get the sense that there's more beyond the frame, more that you can't see, a kind of vast network that you're only getting a little glimpse of. And they betray anxiety in the face of this complexity. At the same time, the process of creating them is a meditative one. So each piece becomes kind of like a mandala or a prayer, a hope for the future. That as we do better, or as we know more, we might do better. So I think that at its best, architectural drawing is about communication, and these drawings and sculptures allow me to communicate that overwhelming sense of anxiety and also of hope. So thank you for allowing me to share them with you tonight.
Hi, everyone. Such an honor to be in this beautiful space, in this beautiful building. Thank you, everyone, for having me. Thank you, Nalina. I studied architecture at the same time as Nalina, and I guess we were both on the sort of cusp of sort of the last generation that did all our drawings by hand before the advent, before they started really doubling down on CAD, teaching CAD, and having that be the sort of MO that most students worked with. So yeah, I felt like we were sort of the cusp, on that cusp. After school, I went to work in the field for many years, but I guess I got somewhat disillusioned with it not too long ago, and I quit working full-time. But what I took away from that experience of sort of leaving the practice behind was that what I really, the sort of connecting thread that really kept me going through this whole time was the process of drawing, and specifically hand drawing, which I sort of came to realize was my strength after many years of going through things in a sort of roundabout way. So I guess I've always been drawing. As a kid, I guess a lot of children, I think most of us as children drew at some point. I sort of took it a little further than that, and I'd been drawing comics specifically as a kid and into my teens and 20s before I came into architecture. But the more I think about it now and have thought about it, there's so many similarities, so many connective threads between all of these disciplines, between, obviously comics are drawn and architecture is drawn as well. So on that very basic level, there is that connective thread. But just trying to find a space for myself after leaving the field, I started to find the connective threads being more and more explicit. I started to do more serious about comics, but I was also starting to do paintings. So I started exploring these sort of architectural fantasias, which was a way for me to channel the energy that I thought I had, or I think I did have in school, the sort of academic pursuits that were for the most part kind of fantasies, right? I mean, there are explorations of program, but they're also works of imagination, of conceptualization and reconceptualization. And it was a very exciting time for me to be in graduate school studying architecture, and I think, a lot of us can relate to this. You lose some of that when you go into an office. But I wanted to take that back, in a way, and refocus it into works where I could explore space and particularly, I was very interested in the role of the figure in space. So a lot of the work that I do has an aspect of the body within these spaces, and I thought that was that's maybe part of my interest in comics, is coming through these paintings. Was I guess for the most part comics are focused on other than abstract comics, a lot of comics are focused on interactions between bodies, between people, between talking heads and bodies and faces. So I wanted to see how bodies relate in a very specific way to architecture. So a lot of these works that I was focusing on at the time are exploring that the role and the space of the body within architecture. I was also interested a lot in perspective. I've always been interested in it as not only as a descriptive tool, but also as a generative tool. I never really studied perspective as such, but sort of learned through just reading and kind of exploring it on my own. A lot of these drawings are here's a classic one-point perspective. A lot of these are actually, they're all freehand. I mean, they're not constructed as such. Obviously I have a vanishing point in this one, but for the most part, they're kind of, I'm using the drawing itself to sort of tell me what the architecture is going to be doing. So they're not constructed in the classic sense. They're kind of, they're ways of using the ways of thinking about perspective as a tool to generate the image. So to some degree, I adhere sometimes to notions or to traditions of perspective, but I also have a certain sort of artistic license and liberty within these drawings to kind of go a little rogue, as it were. I wanted to talk a little bit about the tools that I use. I draw with a lot of the tools that you saw before. I don't use a Mayline. I use T-squares and triangles and pencils and stuff. But so I start off with a pencil underlay, and then usually I move on to inks. So I use and this is sort of within the comics world, I think it's a classic division between people who use brushes and people who use nib pens. So I'm a brush person. I use Winsor & Newton Series 7, number 2 sable brush, which comes to a very, very fine point, which is really helpful for the work I do. And I know a lot of this stuff doesn't look like there's a whole lot of line weight in it, but I think if you were able to see the real thing, you might see that a lot of the bodies themselves are dependent on their presence on a varying line weight. So that's what I use, and India ink. I use watercolors, sort of standard issue, student level watercolors until I feel like I can graduate to something better at some point. I was going to say also that, a lot of this stuff I don't think would be, unless, as an exploration, as a sort of delving into a fantasy, I don't think this kind of work that I do, I don't know of a way to do it without doing it by hand, is what I was going to say. It's like only possible for me to do it with this method that I've learned and that I've learned to love so much. I'm not sure how you would have that exploratory aspect to these kinds of drawings by using a computer. So just wanted to put that out there. So I was going to talk a little bit also about comics and about how in some of these pieces I've been trying to collapse the spaces of representation between comics and architecture. So, we have certain conventions of representation within comics to do with panels that are sequential, and certain conventions of representation in architecture, such as, like a section, for example, or detail drawings that are called out by call-out bubbles and things. So I was trying to, in some of these pieces, collapse the two modes of representation into one hybrid mode. So, for example, in this piece, which is coming out in a book in spring 2020 from Feminist Press, I've taken a section through a building, which is a static representation of an architectural space, but then as you read from left to right, there's a story that's being told, and there's a progression through time, and those moments in time are called out as if they were architectural details, and it's telling a story using that convention. So I've been working with that kind of exploration through my work. Here's another piece from the book that's coming out soon, a sort of hybrid, again, a hybrid piece, which takes various aspects of architectural representation and of comics, modes of representation within comics, and sort of flattens them onto the surface of the page. So yeah, this particular story explores a lot of that, the function of drawing. It's a story about drawing, actually. It's in which the two characters sort of have a relationship through the art of drawing. So it's a very special story for me to tell and to draw. I just also want last thing I wanted to say something about drawing, as Katie was saying, about drawing as a sort of prayer and a sort of meditative function. And, I also draw a lot of mandalas and stuff, and you can see here in the corner here where I was trying to create a sort of hybrid between a sort of cartographic space and the space of a sort of spiritual space. And I was drawing a lot on geometries of mandalas and geometries of maps to sort of create this kind of multi-dimensional space on the page. So I don't know, and it's not only a sort of symbol and an object, but for me, the drawing itself, the drawing of this page, was for me a meditation, and I hope it is for some other people too. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Can Pablo, Katie, and Bishakh join me on stage? Just. Great. Well, thank you for those presentations. It was really thrilling to see your work again. And I think you all talked or spoke very eloquently about why you draw by hand and what your relationship or non-relationship with the computer is. One thing I wanted to ask you about was the time of a drawing. I'm sure many of the people in this room draw, and probably a few don't. So what is the time of a drawing? How long do you think about something before you start? How long do you stay with a drawing? Do you work for 10 hours at a time or 10 minutes at a time? Katie, do you want to start?
Yeah, I usually do one at a time, and I also work full time as an architect. So the types of drawings that you saw in this presentation all happen afterwards. Probably like nights and weekends. It will take me like at least 3 weeks per square foot of drawing.
3 weeks per square foot. That's fascinating. That's a long time. Yeah. Pablo?
How long, when, the time of the drawing? Well, I don't really know. I mean, in my case, that might be not a very interesting thing to think about, because it's, all of our drawings are immersed in the dynamic of what the office needs to do the projects. So the timing of the drawings is left at the mercy of whatever time I can steal from doing 100 million other things, so. Do
you set aside time on your calendar, an hour a day to draw?
No, so to put it in man-rate terms, I draw when I can, if we're doing a project and I don't get to do a drawing, if it's a representational issue, we make a model or even make a computer-generated rendering. Excuse me. But the other kind of drawing that I showed is part of the process. That's happening all the time. Like,
in your notebook?
Yeah, the notebook thing, yeah.
So that's continuous?
Yeah.
Going on in the background?
Yeah, well, I carry the notebook with me. Typically, when I go home in the evening, it's the only thing I take home, and yeah, because, just might wake up at 2 in the morning, I have an idea, and then if you don't put it down at 9 a.m., when I wake up again, I might not remember what it was.
Sure, that's true.
But 90% of the time, it wasn't anything interesting. It just seemed interesting at 2 in the morning.
But you got it down. You got it out. Bishakh?
So I was thinking about the difference between, in my work specifically, about the difference between the comics that I do and the sort of and the paintings, and the time it takes to do the comic, I guess, is quite different because I guess there are more specific details and a certain amount of information that needs to be conveyed with the comic, like because it's telling a story. So I just put down enough on the page to convey that information. And that depends, I usually do a bunch of thumbnails first. And so however much time it takes me to do the final page based on those thumbnails, it's quite finite, right? I would say I can pencil 2 pages a day at most. But with the paintings, which are more like explorations, I'm not sure. I sort of lose it, kind of go into a state where I'm not sure when it's done until I know it achieves the kind of texture and complexity that I'm looking for. But I don't know. It could take days, it could take weeks, but I sort of lose myself in that reverie, so it's hard to tell.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad you mentioned narrative and storytelling, because it struck me as I was listening to the three of you speak that you're all telling stories, that there are very strong narratives attached to your work. Pablo often writes on his drawings in a very beautiful script that seems very private. Even though you're writing it down on your drawing, it seems very private to me, and I would hesitate before reading it. And then Bishakh, in your comics, you're literally writing captions that we're supposed to read to understand the story. And Katie, the narrative in your work is very clear when you speak about it. And when I look at your drawings, I sense that there's something a little bit disturbing going on behind the beautiful lines. Is the story there? Is the story something you know before you start drawing, or is it something that you're working through by drawing it? And why use architecture to tell a story? Or what's the relationship between architecture and text? Do you think in words and in pictures, or Pablo?
Well, I guess, it's a good question, but I think it's also a big question. But one way to think about that is if we allow for a second the notion that drawing is a kind of subservient practice to the production of buildings, which is a socially necessary commodity, then architecture becomes very important, because at any one time, whatever involves the word social is very dangerous and very and crucial, but at the same time easy to be unjust. And if you, to put that in simpler terms, maybe you can say that architecture in its sort of artistic interpretation could be used both as a form of escape or as a form of the pursuit of knowledge, right? And so as an escape, we all need to take a break sometimes. But in our opinion, and I think one of the sort of entertainment factor of architecture, or the distracting factor of architecture, is a way in which architecture might become, in a sort of unaware manner, enlisted in the wrong side of forces that are shaping society. So yes, a story is told, but ideally that story, and it's not always the case, of course, could be interpreted as a story that pursues a kind of clearer or truer understanding of the way that things work, so we can position our work in a way that it could be, meaningful and significant. But, when you say storytelling, immediately, the sort of entertainment factor of literature rises to the surface. Yeah.
Right. It seems suspicious, but it's actually very rich. Katie, do you want to talk a little bit about the narratives behind your work?
Sure, yeah. I guess in these drawings and sculptures that I showed today, I guess the stakes are not quite as high as with drawings that become architecture. But I still do start with a narrative, pretty much with every piece. For the drawings that are a little bit more representational, I'll actually go and research machinery or tools or kind of imagery that will help me sort of build up the drawing. Like with the first one that I showed, for example, it was like a plant being sustained by a bunch of machinery around it, and I actually went and researched how do you synthesize nitrogen, and sort of tried to put all those components together to make it work. And even in the more abstract sculptures, I do still research kind of like the joinery techniques and that there's significant behind like every piece and how every piece goes together. So yeah, narrative is pretty important in all of my work, even the more abstract pieces.
I guess in my case, the storytelling aspect is the most explicit because I am actually writing stories that have images and text combined within them. So that's my stock in trade. That's what I do. But I guess in terms of the sort of standalone paintings, I've always thought of them as telling a story that you can fill in by reading them or by seeing them. I see the architecture as a character in that story also, not just as a background, but as there are several instances of paintings that I've done with two figures, and the architecture is sort of the third unnamed figure in that work. And I think a lot about Cindy Sherman's film stills, which are just for all intents and purposes just sort of still photos, but there's so much. There's a whole narrative behind those that is untold, that you can fill in or that you can bring your own mysteries to. So I take a lot of inspiration from her.
Thanks.
I just want to add, because I didn't mean to put down storytelling. My caveat was if we can accept for a moment that in my case, drawing is a servant of architectural production. But of course, storytelling is culturally and socially crucially important, right? Like Plato's dialogues are storytelling. Borges used to say that Stevenson was, for him, one of the forms of happiness. So as a form of vital substance in someone's life, storytelling is crucially important. Of course, I'm not denying that. I'm just saying in the humble case of my drawing put at the service of producing architecture, I try to avoid storytelling because in some ways I see it as a form of distraction to what the point should be. But not in other people's work or other things. Yeah.
No, it wasn't taken.
Well, I just don't want them to think.
No. I thank you for those insights, and I would like to conclude our discussion by saying that personally, I've been an architect for a long time, and I've always struggled with the fact that I'm turning to literature or to language for deeper meanings. And that literature, or particularly the novel, is the form that has kind of sustained me emotionally for a long time. But I am finally finding in architecture a richness, a similar richness. And I think all three of you showed work today that has that richness, that emotional complexity. It goes really deep, so thank you. Thank you for sharing your work tonight.
So before you leave the stage, we just would like to express our appreciation to you for, one, sharing your exquisite drawings, explaining, expanding upon the narrative that was often attached to them, and basically your in each of your individual cases, your own extraordinary vision. And we are very, very grateful that you could come to the General Society and be part of this panel and discussion tonight. So thank you so much. Okay. We'd like to express our appreciation. We'd like to particularly thank Nalina, who not only put this wonderful book together, and a question would be, I wonder how long it took to research all these drawings and things, but really did this amazing job, and also has worked so hard to put this panel together, and we just want to express our appreciation to you in particular. And of course, we're very grateful to you three as well, but we do want to thank Nalina in particular. So Nalina, could we ask you to come up to the podium? We would like to make a presentation to you, and to do so is our Executive Director, Victoria Dengel.
And thank you to all of you. It was a wonderful presentation, and you opened our eyes to so much this evening. And Nalina, to acknowledge the publication of this wonderful book and all that you've put together, we would like to say that on behalf of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen, founded in 1785, we express our gratitude to Nalina Moses for single-handedly contemporary architects draw by hand, for your participation in the General Society Artisan Lecture Series. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, I'm very proud. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And but we've made all of you our library members, so we'd like you to come back and explore the space more. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. And we do want to give you each a little memento. It's inside you will find, it may not be the right size, but we'll fix that, a General Society t-shirt with our motto, by hammer and hand, all arts do stand. So thank you. I'm sure that many of you have questions, but we decided we'll take questions informally afterwards. But now we are going to have a reception, and thanks in particular to Nalina, we have some delightful snacks to offer you. So I hope you will stay for that. I do want to mention two upcoming programs that may be of particular interest to this audience. We have the architect and engineer Christopher Pinto from Thornton Tomasetti, and he will be speaking on the preservation of cast iron construction. And that's on June 18th. And finally, on June 25th, our last lecture of the series, we are going to be discussing the American Artists Archive, Hand Archive. This is an absolutely stunning collection of bronze live hand castings with many of America's most venerated artists, such as Chuck Close and Jasper Johns. So I do think you'll come back for that. So, and finally, in conclusion, I do want to mention that this marvelous book, Single-Handedly Contemporary Architects Draw by Hand, is for sale at the back of the room, and I'm sure all participants will be willing to autograph the book. Thank you so much again. Thank you very much.